Today we have a story about courage, dignity, and the strange beauty found in unexpected places during the darkest of times. This is the testimony of Emma Williams, a laundress from Birmingham, Alabama, whose journey to France in 1918 changed everything she understood about the world and herself. If you enjoyed this story, consider subscribing and becoming part of our community. Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments. We love hearing from our amazing viewers all around the world. Emma Williams had never imagined she would cross an ocean. At 32 years of age, she had spent her entire life within 20 miles of where she was born, washing linens for white families who rarely looked her in the eye. When the Red Cross announced they needed Negro women to travel to France as laundresses for the colored regiments, Emma saw something she had never seen before: a door opening, even if just a crack. The voyage across the Atlantic took 17 days. Emma shared a cramped cabin below deck with 3 other women: Evelyn from Georgia, Ruth from South Carolina, and Dorothy from Mississippi. They sang spirituals in the darkness, their voices rising and falling with the ship's rhythm, trying to forget the stories they had heard about German submarines lurking beneath the waves. But Paris was nothing like Birmingham. The streets twisted like tangled thread, and everywhere Emma looked, buildings rose up, ancient and proud, wearing their centuries like fine Sunday clothes. The Red Cross stationed her at a depot in the 15th Arrondissement, where mountains of soiled uniforms arrived daily from the front lines, each one telling a story written in mud and blood. The American officer in charge was Captain Robert Thornton, a man from Virginia with pale eyes that never quite focused on her face when he spoke. He had rules, so many rules they seemed to multiply like weeds. The Negro laundresses were to remain in their designated quarters. They were not to speak to French civilians unless absolutely necessary. They were not to venture into certain neighborhoods, attend certain establishments, or forget for one moment the proper order of things. "You girls remember where you come from," Captain Thornton said during their first assembly, his voice flat and cold as winter stone. "France may seem different, but don't let it confuse you. There are ways things are done, and ways things are not done. You're here to work, not to socialize." Emma noticed how he emphasized that last word, as if socializing was something dangerous, something that needed to be prevented like a disease. The first time she saw the Negro soldiers walking through the streets of Paris, Emma felt her heart lift. These were men from her world, from Alabama and Georgia and Louisiana, but they walked differently here. Their backs were straighter, their eyes met the horizon instead of the ground, and the French women, that was the strangest thing of all. On her 3rd day in Paris, Emma witnessed something that made her stop in the middle of the street, her arms full of folded linens. 3 Negro soldiers in American uniforms were walking toward a cafe, and 2 French women at an outside table smiled at them. Not the tight, nervous smile of white women back home who feared being seen. These women smiled with their whole faces, warm and genuine, and one of them called out a greeting in French. The soldiers looked shocked, frozen for a moment, as if they had forgotten how to move. Emma felt Captain Thornton's presence before she saw him. He had appeared beside her like a shadow, watching the same scene with an expression that made her stomach turn cold. "Disgusting," he muttered, barely loud enough for her to hear. "We'll put a stop to that soon enough." That night, lying in her narrow cot, Emma could not sleep. She kept thinking about the soldiers' faces, about that moment of shock and wonder, as if they had stepped into a world where different rules applied. She thought about Captain Thornton's words, the quiet promise of control in his voice. The rules were posted the next morning. They appeared on the barracks wall like a proclamation, written in Captain Thornton's precise handwriting. Negro soldiers were prohibited from entering certain establishments. They were to maintain proper distance from French civilians, particularly French women. Violations would result in disciplinary action, possible court, and immediate return to the United States under disgraceful circumstances. Emma read the notice 3 times, her heart sinking with each word. Evelyn stood beside her, shaking her head slowly. "We crossed an ocean," she whispered, "and brought Mississippi with us." But something else was happening, something Captain Thornton had not anticipated. The French people did not seem to understand the rules he was trying to impose, or perhaps they understood perfectly well and simply refused to follow them. Emma saw it in small moments throughout. That first week, a French shopkeeper who insisted on shaking a Negro soldier's hand, an old woman who stopped to speak with 2 colored men in uniform, her face animated and kind, children who waved and called out greetings without fear or hesitation, and the women, always the women, treating these soldiers like men instead of problems to be managed. Captain Thornton's jaw grew tighter with each passing day. Emma watched him watching the streets, his hands clenched behind his back, his whole body rigid with the effort of maintaining control in a place that refused to be controlled. On Sunday morning, Emma and the other laundresses were given 2 hours of leave to attend services. They walked to a small church near the depot, their heads covered, their voices quiet. But as they passed a park, Emma saw something that made her breath catch. A Negro soldier named Thomas, she had washed his uniforms and knew his name from the careful stitching inside, was sitting on a bench beside a Frenchwoman. They were simply talking, their faces relaxed and open, and the woman was laughing at something he had said. It was the most natural thing in the world, and it was the most impossible thing Emma had ever witnessed. Captain Thornton saw it too. He was standing across the street, perfectly still, watching with an expression that Emma recognized from her childhood in Alabama. It was the look of a man who believed the world was tilting off its axis, and who would do anything to force it back into place. That night, Thomas did not return to the barracks. The whispers spread through the depot like smoke. He had been arrested, confined, accused of conduct unbecoming. The specific charges were vague, shifting, impossible to pin down, but everyone understood the real reason. Emma lay awake in the darkness, listening to the distant sound of artillery from the front lines, and felt a cold dread settling into her bones. She had thought crossing the ocean meant escape. She was beginning to understand that some things followed you across any distance, patient and relentless as winter, and Captain Thornton's rules were only just beginning. The laundry depot operated in constant motion. Steam rose from the great vats where uniforms boiled, and the air hung thick and wet, making it hard to breathe. Emma's hands were raw from lye soap. Her back ached from bending over the washing basins, but she worked without complaint. Work was familiar. Work was safe. Thomas returned after 3 days of confinement. Emma saw him through the window, walking across the courtyard with his head down, his shoulders curved inward. He looked smaller somehow, as if something had been pressed out of him. Captain Thornton called a special assembly that afternoon. All the laundresses and soldiers stationed at the depot were required to attend. They stood in the cold courtyard while the captain paced before them, his boots clicking against the cobblestones with mechanical precision. "Private Thomas Clark has been disciplined for fraternization," Captain Thornton announced, his voice carrying across the silent courtyard. "This behavior will not be tolerated. You are representing the United States Army. You are representing your race. Any further violations will result in immediate court-martial and disgrace." He paused, letting his gaze sweep across the assembled soldiers and laundresses. When his eyes landed on Emma, she felt ice in her stomach. "Some of you may think that because we are in France, the natural order of things has changed." His voice dropped lower, more dangerous. "I assure you, it has not. It will not. I will personally ensure that proper discipline is maintained." After the assembly, Emma returned to the laundry room, her hands shaking as she plunged them into the hot water. Evelyn worked beside her, silent and tense. "That man," Evelyn finally whispered. "He brought the whole weight of home with him, packed it in his trunk and carried it across the ocean." Emma nodded but said nothing. Speaking felt dangerous now. The next morning, Captain Thornton implemented new procedures. The laundresses were no longer permitted to leave the depot without written permission. Their 2 hours of Sunday leave were revoked until further notice. Any conversation with French civilians, even shop owners or street vendors, was to be reported immediately. Emma noticed how these rules applied only to the Negro workers and soldiers. The white officers came and went freely, speaking French with shopkeepers, dining in cafes, strolling through parks without restriction. On the third day, under the new rules, Emma made a mistake. She was carrying a bundle of cleaned uniforms through the depot's back entrance, when she nearly collided with an elderly Frenchwoman. The woman had been delivering bread to the kitchen, and she dropped her basket in the collision. Loaves scattered across the ground. "Pardon," Emma said automatically, kneeling to help gather the bread. "I'm sorry, I didn't see you." The Frenchwoman smiled, her weathered face kind and warm. She said something in rapid French that Emma could not understand, but the tone was friendly, dismissive of the accident. Together they collected the bread, and the old woman patted Emma's hand in thanks. Before shuffling toward the kitchen, the whole interaction lasted perhaps 30 seconds. Captain Thornton had been watching from an upper window. He summoned Emma to his office an hour later. The room was small and spare, with a desk, 2 chairs, and an American flag hanging limp in the corner. The captain sat behind his desk, his face expressionless. "You spoke with a French civilian," he said. "Not a question, a statement." "Sir, I accidentally bumped into her. I was helping her pick up." "You spoke with a French civilian," he repeated, his voice harder now, after being explicitly ordered not to engage with the local population. Emma's throat went dry. "Sir, it was an accident. I was just being polite." Polite. Captain Thornton leaned back in his chair, studying her with those pale, cold eyes. "Do you know what happens when girls like you forget their place, Emma? Do you know what happens when you start thinking that common courtesy applies to you the same way it applies to civilized people?" The words hit her like a slap. Emma kept her face neutral, her hands folded in her lap, but inside she felt something cracking. "You will forfeit 3 days' wages," Captain Thornton continued. "You will work additional hours to make up for the time you wasted in unauthorized fraternization, and you will write a statement acknowledging your violation of direct orders." "Sir, that is all." He waved his hand dismissively. "You may go, and Emma, consider yourself fortunate. Back home, this kind of behavior would have consequences far more severe than lost wages." Emma stood on trembling legs and left the office. She walked through the depot in a daze, barely seeing the corridors around her. 3 days' wages meant she could not send money home to her mother this month. It meant going hungry to make ends meet. But worse than the money was the humiliation, the casual cruelty in Captain Thornton's voice, the way he had looked at her, as if she were something less than human. That evening, Emma sat on her cot, writing the required statement. Her hands shook as she formed the words. "I, Emma Williams, acknowledge that I violated direct orders by engaging in unauthorized conversation with a French civilian. I understand that such behavior is inappropriate and will not repeat this offense." Evelyn sat beside her, reading over her shoulder. "It's like he wants us to forget we're human," she whispered. "Like he wants to remind us of everything we came here to escape." Emma nodded, but she could not speak. If she spoke, she feared she might scream. Later that night, unable to sleep, Emma heard something that made her sit up in the darkness. It was singing, soft and distant, coming from somewhere beyond the deeper walls. A French voice, a woman's voice, singing a melody Emma did not recognize, but that sounded like freedom itself. She moved to the window and looked out across the moonlit streets of Paris. Somewhere out there, French women spoke to Negro soldiers as if they were men. Somewhere out there, the rules that had governed Emma's entire life did not apply. But between her and that world stood Captain Thornton, patient and implacable. A wall built from old hatreds and the determination to make sure nothing ever changed. Emma pressed her forehead against the cold glass and wondered how long she could survive in this strange limbo. This place where freedom existed just beyond reach. Visible but untouchable. In the darkness of his office, Captain Thornton was writing a report. The lamplight cast shadows across his face as he detailed the discipline he had administered, the order he had maintained. His handwriting was precise and beautiful, each letter formed with care. He was building something here, a system, a reminder, a wall to keep the natural order intact, even in this strange country where people seemed to have forgotten how the world was supposed to work. And he would maintain that wall, brick by brick, no matter how many Emma Williamses he had to break along the way. Outside, the singing continued, soft and distant and utterly indifferent to Captain Thornton's rules. Winter settled over Paris like a cold hand. Emma's chilblains made it painful to grip the washing paddles, but she worked without complaint. Silence had become her shield, the only protection she had against Captain Thornton's watchful eyes. The new rules continued to multiply. Now the laundresses were required to sign in and out of the depot, recording their exact movements during any authorized absences. A curfew was established. All Negro personnel must be inside the compound by 6 o'clock each evening, even though the white officers came and went as they pleased, often returning well after midnight smelling of wine and cigarettes. Emma noticed everything, and said nothing, but others were not as quiet. A soldier named James Porter, a man from Louisiana with gentle eyes and careful hands, was caught speaking with a French family outside a church. The family had invited him to Sunday dinner. He had accepted, thinking such kindness deserved acknowledgement. Captain Thornton confined him for a week. Another soldier, William Hayes, was seen walking through a park with a French woman and her elderly mother. He had been helping them carry parcels from the market, nothing more. But someone had reported him, and Captain Thornton added a new rule. Negro soldiers were prohibited from providing assistance to French civilians under any circumstances. "He's trying to make us invisible," Ruth said one evening as they folded linens in the steamy workroom. "He wants us to move through this city like ghosts, never touching anything, never being seen." Emma nodded, her fingers working automatically, creasing and smoothing the fabric. But she was thinking about something else, something she had noticed but had not yet spoken aloud. The French people were pushing back. It was subtle at first. A shopkeeper who insisted on serving Negro soldiers even after being told by Captain Thornton to refuse them. A cafe owner who created a private room where colored soldiers could eat without being visible from the street. A quiet act of defiance against the captain's wishes. A priest who welcomed everyone to Mass, regardless of Captain Thornton's suggestions that separate services might be more appropriate than the women. Always the women, refusing to treat these men as untouchable. Emma saw it one afternoon when she was granted permission to purchase thread for mending uniforms. The small shop was run by a French woman named Madame Beaumont, a widow whose husband had died in the war. When Emma entered, head down and quiet, Madame Beaumont greeted her warmly in broken English. "Welcome, welcome. You are from the laundry?" "Yes." She smiled, her face lined but kind. "I see you working so hard. Please, sit. I bring tea." Emma froze, uncertain. "Ma'am, I'm not supposed to sit," Madame Beaumont insisted, pulling out a chair. "This is France. In France, we do not let guests stand like servants." The tea was hot and sweet, and Emma's hands trembled as she held the cup. She could not remember the last time someone had invited her to sit, had offered her refreshment as if she were worthy of such consideration. Madame Beaumont chatted in her mixed French and English, speaking about her shop, her late husband, the terrible war. She did not seem to notice or care that Emma was Negro. She simply talked to her as one woman talks to another. When Emma left with her thread, Madame Beaumont pressed a small package into her hands. "For you," she said. "Biscuits, you are too thin." Emma walked back to the depot in a daze, the package clutched against her chest, tears burning behind her eyes. She did not see Captain Thornton watching from across the street, his jaw tight, his pale eyes tracking her every movement. The next day, Captain Thornton summoned all the laundresses for an emergency meeting. He stood before them, rigid and cold, holding a piece of paper. "It has come to my attention," he said, his voice clipped and precise, "that some of you have been accepting gifts from French civilians. This practice will cease immediately. Any packages, food items, or personal gifts must be reported and surrendered for inspection." Emma's heart sank. Someone had told him about the biscuits. Furthermore, Captain Thornton continued, "I am implementing a new policy. All purchases must be made through official army channels. You will no longer be permitted to visit French shops independently. This is for your own protection." Ruth raised her hand hesitantly. "Sir, the army suppliers don't have thread, or mending needles, or then you will make do without." Captain Thornton interrupted. "These rules are not negotiable." Dismissed as they filed out. Emma felt Evelyn's hand squeeze her arm. "He's closing every door," Evelyn whispered. "Every single one." But that night, something changed. Emma was walking through the depot's dim corridor when she heard voices coming from a storage room. She recognized one voice immediately, Sergeant Daniel Brooks, a Negro soldier from Virginia who worked as a clerk in the administrative office. The other voice belonged to a white lieutenant named Mitchell, a Massachusetts man who had always seemed uncomfortable with Captain Thornton's policies. "These restrictions are getting out of hand," Lieutenant Mitchell was saying. "The French are starting to complain. They don't understand why we're treating our own soldiers like prisoners." "Captain Thornton says it's about maintaining discipline," Sergeant Brooks replied carefully. "Discipline?" Lieutenant Mitchell's voice carried disgust. "This isn't discipline, Sergeant. This is something else entirely. I've been documenting everything. The confinements, the wage forfeitures, the restrictions. None of it follows proper army protocol." Emma's breath caught. Someone was paying attention. Someone was keeping records. "Sir, with respect," Sergeant Brooks said quietly, "documenting might not be enough. The captain has powerful friends back home. He's connected to people who believe." "I know what he believes," Lieutenant Mitchell interrupted, "and I know what the Army's official position is supposed to be. These two things are not the same." Emma slipped away before they could discover her listening, but hope had sparked inside her chest, small and fragile as a match flame. Someone was watching. Someone was keeping track. The next Sunday, Despite the restrictions, Emma found a way to attend Mass at the small church near the depot. She needed to feel something beyond the laundry steam and Captain Thornton's cold surveillance. She needed to remember that God saw her as more than what this man said she was. The church was full of French families and a handful of Negro soldiers who had received special permission to attend. Emma sat in the back, her head covered, her hands folded in prayer. The priest spoke in French, but Emma understood the tone: compassion, welcome, love for all God's children. When it came time for communion, the priest moved through the congregation without distinction, offering the sacrament to French and American, white and Negro, each person equally worthy in the eyes of God. Emma knelt to receive communion, and when she lifted her head, she saw Captain Thornton standing at the back of the church. He had not come to worship, he had come to watch, to count, to document who dared to treat these restrictions as if they did not exist. Their eyes met across the church. In that moment, Emma saw something that chilled her blood. It was not anger in his face, it was patience, the expression of a man who believed that time and persistence would eventually break everyone down, would restore the proper order of things. Emma looked away first, her heart pounding, but as she walked back to the depot in the cold afternoon light, she thought about Lieutenant Mitchell's words: documentation, records, proper protocol. Captain Thornton had power, but power built on violations and cruelty might have cracks, and if there were cracks, perhaps something could grow through them. That night, Emma began her own record. Using the backs of damaged laundry tickets, she wrote down dates and details: who was confined and why, what wages were forfeited, which rules violated proper army procedure. Her handwriting was careful and small, and she hid the papers inside her Bible. She did not know if her records would ever matter, but documenting felt like resistance, like refusing to let these cruelties disappear into silence. In his office, Captain Thornton was writing another report, detailing the continued need for strict discipline among the colored personnel. He wrote about the corrupting influence of French society, the importance of maintaining American standards, the necessity of control. He signed his name with a flourish, confident in his righteousness. But outside his window, Paris continued to live and breathe, a city that refused to bend to his vision of how the world should be ordered. And inside the depot, small acts of record-keeping had begun, quiet and patient as prayer. The pressure was rising. Something would have to break. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in late January. Emma recognized her mother's handwriting immediately, the careful script learned late in life, each letter formed with concentration and love. She opened it during her brief lunch break, her hands still damp from the washing vats. The first lines made her smile: news from home, mention of neighbors, her mother's gentle complaints about the winter cold. But then the tone shifted. Emma, I hate to burden you with troubles when you are so far away, but I must tell you the landlord has raised our rent again. I am working as much as I can, but my hands are not what they used to be, and the arthritis makes it hard to take in as much washing as before. I know you have been sending what you can, but if it is possible to send a bit more, even just for these next few months, it would ease my heart considerably. Please do not worry about me. I trust in God's provision. Emma read the letter 3 times, then folded it carefully and tucked it into her pocket. Her mother had never asked for more money before. The request told Emma everything about how desperate things had become, but there was no more money to send. Captain Thornton had already taken 3 days' wages. The additional work hours he had imposed meant Emma had less time for the mending work she did privately for other soldiers. The few extra coins that had helped make ends meet. She sat in the cold break room, staring at her raw hands, and felt the weight of impossible choices pressing down on her shoulders. That afternoon, Emma approached Sergeant Brooks in the administrative office. He looked up from his paperwork, his expression cautious. "Sergeant, I need to speak with Captain Thornton about my wages," Emma said quietly. "I need to request that the forfeiture be reconsidered. My mother is ill." And Sergeant Brooks' voice was kind but firm. "I can submit the request, but I need to tell you honestly, he won't change his mind. He never does." "Please," Emma said, "I have to try." The request was submitted. 2 days later, Emma was summoned to Captain Thornton's office. He did not invite her to sit. She stood before his desk while he read through her written appeal, his face expressionless. When he finished, he set the paper down and looked at her. "Your personal circumstances," he said slowly, "are not the Army's concern. You violated a direct order. Actions have consequences. This is a lesson you apparently have not yet learned. Sir, my mother, your mother, should have raised you better, Captain Thornton interrupted. Perhaps then you would understand the importance of obedience and discipline. Request denied. The words struck Emma like physical blows. She stood perfectly still, fighting to keep her face neutral, to not give him the satisfaction of seeing her break. However, Captain Thornton continued, leaning back in his chair, I am not without mercy. I am willing to offer you an opportunity to earn back your forfeited wages. Emma's heart lifted slightly. Sir, there is additional work that needs to be done. The officers' quarters require deep cleaning. You will report there after your regular laundry shift, 7 days a week, for the next month. If you complete this work to my satisfaction, I will restore your wages. Emma calculated quickly. The laundry shift ended at 6 o'clock. The additional cleaning would take at least 3 hours. 10 hours of work per day, 7 days a week, with no day of rest, no time for private mending work, no time for anything but exhaustion. But her mother needed the money. Yes, sir, Emma said quietly. Thank you, sir. One more thing. Captain Thornton's voice stopped her as she turned to leave. I will be inspecting your work personally. I have very high standards. Any deficiency, any shortcut, any failure to meet expectations will result in immediate dismissal from this opportunity. Do you understand? Yes, sir. Emma left his office with her legs trembling. She understood perfectly. Captain Thornton was not offering mercy. He was offering another form of punishment, disguised as generosity. He would work her until she collapsed, and then he would find fault anyway. But what choice did she have? The work began that evening. The officers' quarters occupied an entire floor of a requisitioned building near the depot. Emma arrived at 6:30, her body already aching from the day's laundry work, and found a list of tasks waiting for her. Scrub floors, polish brass, clean windows, dust furniture, wash linens, empty chamber pots. Captain Thornton appeared at 7 o'clock to inspect her progress. He said nothing, just walked through the rooms, his boots clicking against the floorboards, occasionally running a finger along a surface to check for dust. He found fault with the way she had folded the towels. Redo them, he said curtly. All of them. The corners must be perfectly aligned. Emma redid the towels, her hands shaking with exhaustion. This became the pattern. Every evening, Captain Thornton would inspect her work and find something wrong. The brass was not polished to a sufficient shine. The floors showed streaks. The windows had spots. Each time, he would order her to redo the work, his voice calm and clinical, as if this was simply a matter of maintaining proper standards. Emma worked until 9, sometimes 10 o'clock at night. She stumbled back to her quarters too exhausted to eat, collapsing onto her cot with her muscles screaming and her hands bleeding from the harsh cleaning solutions. Evelyn and Ruth tried to help, but Emma refused. This is my task, she said. I have to do it myself, or he'll say I cheated. On the 6th night, Emma was scrubbing the captain's office floor when she overheard a conversation. Captain Thornton was speaking with another white officer in the hallway, their voices carrying clearly through the half-open door. How long are you going to keep this up? The other officer asked. You're working that girl to death. I'm teaching her a lesson, Captain Thornton replied. These people need to understand that there are consequences for forgetting their place. She thought she could befriend French civilians, thought the rules didn't apply to her. I'm reminding her that they do. I will always remind her, but the wages will never be restored. Captain Thornton said flatly. I'll find fault with her work on the final day, but by then, she have learned what she needed to learn. They all will. Every Negro in this depot will see what happens when you try to step outside the boundaries. Emma's hands stopped moving. She knelt on the cold floor, the scrub brush dripping in her grip, and understood with perfect clarity that she had never had a chance. This was not about cleaning or standards or earning back wages. This was about cruelty for its own sake, about breaking her spirit and using her as an example. She thought about her mother waiting for money that would never come. She thought about the month of her life that would be stolen by this charade. She thought about every humiliation she had ever swallowed, every injustice she had ever endured in silence. Every time she had made herself small and quiet and invisible to survive, and something inside her changed. Emma stood up slowly, setting down the scrub brush. Her legs were steady, her hands had stopped shaking. Fear still lived in her chest, but it was no longer the only thing there. She thought about Lieutenant Mitchell keeping records, She thought about Madame Beaumont offering tea as if Emma were worthy of sitting. She thought about French women smiling at Negro soldiers without fear or shame. She thought about Sergeant Brooks' careful documentation, and her own hidden notes, and the priest offering communion without distinction. Power could be challenged. Cruelty could be exposed. The rules that seemed absolute might have cracks after all. Emma left the officers' quarters that night and went directly to find Sergeant Brooks. She knocked on his office door, not caring about the late hour. When he opened it, she said simply, "I need to tell you everything, and I need you to write it down." In his office across the compound, Captain Thornton sat at his desk, satisfied with the evening's work. He had seen Emma's spirit bending, had watched the exhaustion settling into her bones. A few more weeks and she would be completely broken, a perfect example for the others. He did not know that the example he was creating was not the one he intended. He did not know that testimony was being given, records were being compiled, and the pressure he had so carefully applied was about to escape his control. The breaking point had been reached, but it was not Emma who had broken. Sergeant Daniel Brooks listened to Emma's testimony for 2 hours, his pen moving steadily across the paper. He wrote down dates, times, specific statements, witnesses. When Emma's voice faltered, he waited patiently until she could continue. When tears came, he offered his handkerchief without comment. "This is not the first complaint I've received about Captain Thornton," he said when she finished, "but it's the most detailed, the most damning." "What happens now?" Emma asked. "Now I take this to Lieutenant Mitchell. He's been building a case, but he needed testimony from someone willing to speak on record. Most are too afraid." Emma nodded. Fear still lived in her, but it no longer governed her. "I'm afraid," she admitted, "but I'm more afraid of what happens if no one ever speaks." Sergeant Brooks looked at her with something like admiration. "You're braver than you know." Emma Williams. The next morning, Emma did not report for the additional cleaning work. She waited in her quarters, expecting Captain Thornton's fury, expecting punishment or dismissal or worse. But nothing happened. The morning passed in strange silence. At noon, Sergeant Brooks found her in the laundry room. "Lieutenant Mitchell has taken your testimony to the Provost Marshal," he said quietly, his voice barely audible over the sound of the washing vats. "There's going to be an investigation." Emma's hands stilled in the hot water. "What does that mean?" "It means Captain Thornton is being questioned. It means his records are being reviewed. It means you've started something that can't be stopped now." That afternoon, the entire depot felt different. Word had spread somehow, the way news always spread in close quarters. The laundresses worked with their heads held slightly higher. The soldiers moved with a different energy, as if the air pressure had shifted. Captain Thornton called an assembly at 4 o'clock. Everyone gathered in the courtyard, the winter wind cutting through their uniforms. The captain stood before them, his face like carved stone. "It has come to my attention," he said, his voice tight with controlled rage, "that certain individuals have been making false accusations against superior officers. This constitutes insubordination of the highest order. Anyone found to have participated in spreading lies or undermining military authority will face immediate court-martial." His eyes scanned the assembled crowd and landed on Emma. The weight of his gaze was meant to crush her, to make her lower her head in shame and fear. Emma looked back at him, her chin steady, her hands calm at her sides. It was Lieutenant Mitchell who broke the silence. Stepping forward with papers in his hand, "Captain Thornton, I have orders from the Provost Marshal. You are relieved of command pending an investigation into allegations of conduct unbecoming an officer. These soldiers and laundresses are no longer under your direct authority." The courtyard went perfectly still. No one moved. No one breathed. Captain Thornton's face flushed red, then went pale. "This is outrageous. These allegations are fabrications by malcontents and troublemakers. I have served this army honorably for 15 years. The investigation will determine the truth of the allegations." Lieutenant Mitchell interrupted calmly. "Please surrender your command logs and personnel records to Sergeant Brooks." For a long moment, Emma thought Captain Thornton might refuse, might rage and threaten and try to maintain control through sheer force of will. But something in Lieutenant Mitchell's steady gaze, something in the official orders he held, made resistance impossible. Captain Thornton's jaw worked silently. Then he turned on his heel and strode toward the administrative building, his back rigid, every line of his body radiating fury. The courtyard remained silent for several heartbeats after he disappeared. Then, like a wave breaking, whispers began. relief, disbelief, hope, fear that this might be temporary, that the investigation might restore him. Emma felt Evelyn's hand find hers and squeeze tight. That evening, Lieutenant Mitchell called Emma to his temporary office. Unlike Captain Thornton's spare room, this office felt lived in, with books stacked on the desk and a photograph of a young woman in a silver frame. "Miss Williams," he said, gesturing for her to sit. "I want to explain what happens next. The Provost Marshal is conducting a formal investigation. He'll need to interview you, along with others who have experienced or witnessed Captain Thornton's behavior. This won't be easy. Captain Thornton will have a chance to defend himself, and he has friends in powerful positions." "I understand, sir," Emma said. Lieutenant Mitchell leaned forward. "Because I need you to understand that speaking truth to power always comes with costs. Even if this investigation results in disciplinary action against Captain Thornton, there will be people who believe you caused trouble, who think you should have stayed quiet. Are you prepared for that?" Emma thought about her mother's letter, still tucked in her Bible. She thought about Thomas Clark, reduced and broken by 3 days of confinement. She thought about every rule designed to make them invisible, every humiliation meant to remind them of their supposed place. "Sir," she said quietly, "I've spent my whole life paying costs for other people's comfort. At least this time, I'll be paying for something I chose." Lieutenant Mitchell nodded slowly. "The investigation will take several weeks. In the meantime, I'm implementing new policies. The restrictions on movement and association with French civilians are suspended. Any wage forfeitures issued under questionable circumstances will be reviewed, and I'm establishing a formal process for reporting grievances without fear of retaliation." Hope swelled in Emma's chest, but she kept her voice steady. "What about the cleaning work? The wages Captain Thornton promised to restore? Those wages will be restored immediately, and you will not be required to complete any additional work hours. What he did was extortion, plain and simple, and it violated army regulations." Emma felt tears burning behind her eyes, but she blinked them back. "Thank you, sir." "Don't thank me," Lieutenant Mitchell said. "Thank yourself for having the courage to speak. Most people never find that courage." Over the next week, the Provost Marshal conducted interviews. Emma told her story 3 times, once to the Provost Marshal himself, once to a legal officer, and once to an army chaplain who documented cases of moral conduct violations. Each time, she spoke clearly and honestly, providing dates and details, naming witnesses. Others came forward too. Thomas Clark testified about his confinement. James Porter described being punished for helping French civilians. The widow Madame Beaumont was interviewed and confirmed that American officers had pressured her to refuse service to Negro soldiers. Even some white officers provided testimony. One admitted that Captain Thornton had privately expressed his intention to keep these Negroes in their place, and had bragged about using regulations as tools of racial control rather than legitimate military discipline. The documentation grew thick and damning. But Captain Thornton was not idle. He hired a lawyer from Paris, a man with connections to wealthy American Rumors began to circulate. Emma was a troublemaker, a malcontent who had fabricated charges because she resented discipline. The other testifying soldiers were liars seeking to escape proper military authority. Emma heard the whispers and ignored them. She had expected this. Truth and lies were easier to speak than justice was to achieve. On a cold February afternoon, Emma was granted permission to leave the depot for the first time in weeks. She walked to Madame Beaumont's shop, needing to be somewhere kind and warm. The French woman greeted her with delight, insisting on tea and biscuits, chattering about the neighborhood news. When Emma finally explained what had been happening, Madame Beaumont's face grew serious. "This man, this captain," she said in her careful English, "he is afraid." "Afraid?" Emma shook her head. "He has all the power." Nan. Madame Beaumont waved her hand dismissively. "Men who have real power, they do not need to be cruel. They do not need to make rules and rules and rules. This man is afraid of what happens when people see each other as people. He is afraid of what you represent." "I don't represent anything," Emma said. "I'm just a laundress." Madame Beaumont reached across and took Emma's hand. "You represent the truth that his whole world is built on lies. That is why he fights so hard. That is why you must fight harder." Walking back to the depot in the gathering dusk, Emma thought about those words. She had never considered herself as representing anything larger than her own survival. But perhaps Madame Beaumont was right. Perhaps every quiet act of dignity, Every refusal to accept degradation was a small crack in the wall of lies that men like Captain Thornton needed to maintain their power. The investigation continued. The storm was gathering, and Emma Williams, a simple laundress from Birmingham, Alabama, stood at its center, no longer invisible, no longer silent in his temporary quarters, stripped of command but not yet formally charged. Captain Thornton paced like a caged animal. He was writing letters, calling in favors, building his defense. He had powerful friends who believed as he did, who saw this investigation as a dangerous precedent. The battle was far from over, but for the first time, it was actually a battle, not just a massacre. And that changed everything. The formal hearing was scheduled for the first week of March, to be held in the main administrative building. Emma learned this from Sergeant Brooks, who had become a quiet ally, keeping her informed of each development. "The Provost Marshal is taking this seriously," Brooks told her, "but you need to prepare yourself. Captain Thornton's lawyer is preparing an aggressive defense. They're going to attack your character, your credibility. They'll try to paint you as vindictive and dishonest." Emma nodded. She had expected nothing less, but something was happening beyond the walls of the military depot, something Captain Thornton had not anticipated. The French press had gotten word of the case. It began with a small article in a local Paris newspaper, written by a journalist who had heard about the investigation from Madame Beaumont. The article described the restrictions Captain Thornton had imposed, the punishments he had administered, the systematic effort to prevent Negro soldiers from being treated as human beings by French civilians. The article was titled, "La Hypocrisie Américaine, American Hypocrisy." It pointed out the bitter irony that America had sent these men to fight for freedom, while denying them basic dignity. The story spread. Other papers picked it up. French citizens who had befriended Negro soldiers wrote letters to editors, describing their confusion and anger at the American military's attempts to impose racial restrictions on French soil. A delegation of French civilians, including Madame Beaumont, submitted a formal complaint to the American military command, stating that the restrictions violated French sovereignty and insulted French values of eaglite and fraternity. The pressure was building from an unexpected direction. Captain Thornton's supporters tried to suppress the French press coverage, but it was too late. The story had taken on a life of its own. French society, still raw from the devastation of the Great War, had opened its arms to all soldiers who had fought for freedom. The idea that American officers were trying to export racial oppression to French soil struck many as deeply offensive. Emma learned about the press coverage from Lieutenant Mitchell, who showed her one of the translated articles during a preparation meeting for the hearing. "You've become something of a cause célèbre," he said with a faint smile. "The French are calling you heroine de la dignité, a heroine of dignity." Emma felt overwhelmed. "Sir, I'm not a heroine. I just told the truth." "Sometimes," Lieutenant Mitchell said quietly, "that's exactly what heroism is." The day before the hearing, Emma received an unexpected visitor. A Frenchwoman in her early 50s, elegantly dressed, arrived at the depot and asked to speak with her. Her name was Madame Claudette Rousseau, and she introduced herself as a representative of a French women's society. "We have been following your case," Madame Rousseau said in excellent English. "We would like to attend the hearing tomorrow as observers. We believe the world should witness what happens when truth confronts injustice." Emma felt panic rising. "Ma'am, I appreciate your support, but I don't want this to become a spectacle. I just want justice for what happened." Madame Rousseau's expression softened. "My dear, justice often requires witnesses. Captain Thornton has operated in shadows, relying on silence and fear. Light is the enemy of such men. Let us bring light." That evening, Emma barely slept. She lay in her cot, watching shadows move across the ceiling, rehearsing her testimony in her mind. Fear and hope wrestled inside her chest, neither gaining the upper hand. The hearing room was packed when Emma arrived the next morning. She had expected a small, private proceeding, but instead found herself facing rows of observers, French civilians, American officers, journalists with notebooks, Madame Rousseau and her delegation of French women sitting in dignified silence. Captain Thornton sat at a table with his lawyer, a severe-looking man in an expensive suit. When Thornton's eyes met Emma's, she saw hatred there, pure and undisguised. The Provost Marshal, a colonel named Richard Hayes, called the hearing to order. He was a serious man in his 50s, with grey hair and tired eyes that had seen too much war. hearing will determine whether Captain Robert Thornton violated military regulations and engaged in conduct unbecoming an officer," Colonel Hayes announced. "We will hear testimony from multiple witnesses. Miss Emma Williams, please approach." Emma stood and walked to the witness chair, her legs steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. She placed her hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth. The legal officer began the questioning, taking Emma through her testimony methodically. The incident with Madame Beaumont, the wage forfeiture, the impossible cleaning work, Captain Thornton's admission that he never intended to restore her wages. Emma spoke clearly, her voice calm and factual. She did not exaggerate. She did not need to. The truth was damning enough. Then Captain Thornton's lawyer stood for cross-examination. "Miss Williams," he began, his tone dripping with condescension, "you claim Captain Thornton treated you unfairly, but isn't it true that you violated a direct order when you spoke with the French civilian?" "Yes, sir, but it was an accidental encounter, and I was just being polite." "A violation is a violation," the lawyer interrupted. "You broke the rules, and you were disciplined. That's not unfair. That's military justice." "The discipline was disproportionate," Emma said quietly, "and the additional work was a trap designed to give you an opportunity to earn back what you had forfeited." The lawyer cut in again. "An opportunity you failed to take advantage of because you were unwilling to meet proper standards." "I was willing," Emma said, her voice steady, "but the standards were impossible. Captain Thornton admitted in private conversation that he never intended to restore my wages, that the entire exercise was designed to break my spirit and serve as an example to others." "Alleged admission," the lawyer corrected, "based on a conversation you claim to have overheard. Convenient, isn't it? No witnesses. Just your word against the decorated officers." "I have witnesses to everything else," Emma said. "To the excessive discipline, the cruel restrictions, the systematic effort to humiliate and control Negro soldiers and workers." The lawyer smiled coldly. "Or perhaps you're simply a malcontent who resents proper discipline and has convinced other malcontents to support your lies." Objection. Lieutenant Mitchell stood. "Counsel is attacking the witness's character without evidence." Colonel Hayes nodded. "Sustained. Counselor, stick to the facts." The examination continued for another hour. Captain Thornton's lawyer tried every angle, suggesting Emma was lying, implying she had fabricated evidence, questioning her intelligence and credibility. But Emma held firm, answering each question with quiet dignity, never losing her composure. When she finally stepped down, she felt drained but unbroken. The hearing continued for 3 days. Thomas Clark testified about his confinement. James Porter described the arbitrary punishments. Madame Beaumont spoke about the pressure American officers had placed on French businesses to refuse service to Negro soldiers. Most devastating was the testimony from a white officer named Captain Gerald Morrison. He had served alongside Captain Thornton and admitted, under oath, that Thornton had explicitly stated his intention to keep the Negroes in their place and had used military regulations as tools of racial oppression rather than legitimate discipline. "Captain Thornton told me that he saw this assignment as an opportunity," Morrison testified, his face flushed with shame. "He said the war had given these colored soldiers ideas above their station, and it was our duty to remind them of the natural order. I didn't object at the time. I should have. I'm testifying now because my silence made me complicit in what he did." The room was utterly silent when Morrison finished. Captain Thornton took the stand in his own defense, denying everything. He claimed his restrictions were necessary for military discipline, that the punishments were appropriate, that any appearance of racial motivation was a misunderstanding of proper command. But his denials rang hollow against the mountain of testimony and documentation. On the 3rd day, Colonel Hayes announced that he would take 2 weeks to review the evidence before issuing his findings. The hearing was adjourned. Emma walked out of the building into the weak March sunlight, surrounded by Evelyn and Ruth and Dorothy. Madame Rousseau approached them, her eyes shining. "You were magnificent," she said. "You spoke truth with such dignity. France is proud to have witnessed it." That evening, exhausted but unable to sleep, Emma sat in the small chapel near the depot. She prayed, not for victory, but for wisdom to accept whatever came next, for strength to continue regardless of the outcome. She heard footsteps and looked up to find Sergeant Brooks standing in the doorway. "I wanted you to know," he said quietly, "that regardless of what Colonel Hayes decides, what you did mattered. You stood up. You spoke truth. You showed everyone that these systems of cruelty can be challenged. That matters more than you know." Emma nodded, tears finally falling. "I'm so tired, Daniel." "I know," he said kindly, "but you can rest now. The testimony is given. The truth is spoken. Whatever happens next, it's out of your hands." Emma sat in the chapel long after Sergeant Brooks left, letting tears flow freely for the first time since this ordeal began. She cried for her mother back home, for all the years of swallowed humiliation, for the weight of standing alone against power. But beneath the exhaustion and tears, something else lived: pride. She had spoken. She had not been broken. She had proven that simple dignity could challenge institutional cruelty. The scales had tipped. Now they waited to see which way justice would fall. The 2 weeks of waiting felt like 2 years. Emma returned to her laundry work, falling into the rhythm of washing and folding, trying to lose herself in the familiar steam and routine. But everything felt different now. The other laundresses treated her with a mixture of admiration and fear, as if she had done something both heroic and dangerous. French newspapers continued to cover the case. Emma could not read French, but Madame Beaumont would translate the headlines for her. "American captain faces justice for racial cruelty. French society supports brave laundress. The fight for dignity in post-war Paris." The attention made Emma deeply uncomfortable. She had not wanted to be a symbol or a cause. She had simply wanted fairness, wanted to send money to her mother, wanted to be treated as human. But symbols, she was learning, were not chosen. They simply happened to people who stood in the right place at the right moment and refused to move. On the 13th day of waiting, Sergeant Brooks found Emma in the laundry room. "Colonel Hayes has reached his decision," he said. "The reading will be tomorrow at 10 o'clock in the morning. You're required to attend." Emma nodded, her stomach twisting into knots. That night, she barely slept. She prayed and worried in equal measure, imagining every possible outcome. What if Colonel Hayes sided with Captain Thornton? What if power protected power, as it so often did? What if her testimony had been for nothing? The hearing room was even more crowded for the reading than it had been for the testimony. French civilians filled the observers' seats. American soldiers and officers lined the walls. Journalists crowded into every available space. Emma sat in the front row beside Lieutenant Mitchell. Captain Thornton sat across the aisle, his face impassive, his lawyer beside him. Colonel Hayes entered precisely at 10 o'clock. Everyone stood, then sat again in a rustle of uniforms and civilian clothes. This hearing was convened to determine whether Captain Robert Thornton violated military regulations and engaged in conduct unbecoming an officer. Colonel Hayes began, his voice formal and clear. "I have reviewed all testimony, examined all documentation, and consulted with superior officers and military legal experts. I am now prepared to present my findings." He picked up a thick document and began to read. "After careful consideration, I find that Captain Robert Thornton did willfully and systematically abuse his authority as commanding officer. The evidence demonstrates that Captain Thornton imposed restrictions on Negro personnel that exceeded his lawful authority and were motivated not by legitimate military necessity but by personal racial prejudice." Emma's heart began to pound. Colonel Hayes continued, his voice steady and implacable. "Specifically, I find that Captain Thornton violated Army Regulation 47 regarding equitable treatment of all soldiers, regardless of race. I find that he imposed wage forfeitures without proper justification and due process. I find that he created additional work requirements as a form of extortion and punishment rather than legitimate discipline. I find that he attempted to restrict the movement and association rights of American personnel in violation of both military regulations and French sovereignty." Captain Thornton's face had gone white. "Then read." Furthermore, Colonel Hayes said, "Testimony from multiple witnesses, including white officers under Captain Thornton's command. He establishes that these violations were not isolated incidents, but part of a systematic pattern of conduct designed to enforce racial subordination through abuse of military authority." The colonel paused, looking directly at Captain Thornton. "Captain Thornton, I find you guilty of conduct unbecoming an officer, abuse of authority, and violation of military regulations. You are hereby stripped of your command permanently. You will be demoted to the rank of lieutenant and transferred immediately to a non-command position stateside. Additionally, you will forfeit 6 months' pay, which will be distributed among the personnel you unlawfully penalized." The room erupted in whispers. Colonel Hayes brought his gavel down hard. Furthermore, he continued over the noise, I am recommending that the army implement immediate reforms to prevent such abuses in the future. Clear guidelines will be established regarding the treatment of Negro personnel, with specific mechanisms for reporting and investigating complaints. No commanding officer will be permitted to impose restrictions based on race without explicit justification and oversight. He set down the document and looked around the room. This hearing is concluded. Captain Thornton and Lieutenant Thornton, you are dismissed from this command immediately. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Captain Thornton stood slowly, his face a mask of barely controlled fury. He looked at Emma with such hatred that she felt it like a physical force. This is a travesty, he said, his voice shaking. A decorated officer destroyed by lies, and Lieutenant Thornton. Colonel Hayes interrupted, his voice like iron. You are dismissed. Leave now, or I will have you removed. Thornton's lawyer placed a hand on his arm, and after a moment, the former captain turned and walked out of the room, his back rigid, his hands clenched into fists. The moment he disappeared, the room exploded into noise. French civilians applauded. American soldiers murmured in shock and approval. Journalists scribbled furiously in their notebooks. Emma sat perfectly still, unable to process what had just happened. Justice. Actual justice. Not the justice she had dreamed about in abstract terms, but real, concrete consequences for real, documented cruelty. Madame Rousseau was suddenly there, embracing her, speaking rapid French that Emma could not understand but whose meaning was clear. Lieutenant Mitchell was shaking her hand, his eyes bright. Evelyn and Ruth were crying and laughing simultaneously, but Emma felt strangely distant from it all, as if she were watching from outside her own body. It was not until later, when the crowd had dispersed and Emma stood alone in the chapel again, that the reality truly hit her. She had spoken truth to power, and power had been forced to acknowledge that truth, not because she was special, not because she was heroic, but simply because she had refused to accept lies as inevitable. She thought about her mother back in Birmingham, who would receive the restored wages plus additional compensation. She thought about Thomas Clark and James Porter, and all the other soldiers who had been punished for the crime of being treated as human beings. She thought about Madame Beaumont and the French women who had insisted on seeing Negro soldiers as men worthy of basic kindness. And she thought about Robert Thornton, stripped of his power, forced to face consequences for his cruelty. It was not revenge she felt. It was something quieter and deeper. Validation. The testimony that her dignity mattered, that the system's cruelty had been named and condemned. That silence did not have to be the price of survival. That evening, a celebration was held in the depot's common room. Someone had obtained wine from a French shop. Negro soldiers and white officers who had supported the investigation mingled freely, the old boundaries temporarily suspended. Sergeant Brooks raised a toast to Emma Williams, who reminded us all that courage doesn't require rank or position. It just requires truth. Emma felt her face flush. She had never been comfortable with attention, with praise, but she accepted it now because she understood it was not really about her. It was about what her testimony represented, the possibility that even the most powerless could speak and be heard. Lieutenant Mitchell approached her later in the evening, his expression serious. Miss Williams, I want you to know that this changes things. Colonel Hayes's recommendations will become official policy. Future commanding officers will not be able to do what Thornton did. You've helped create a precedent that will protect others. I just wanted justice for myself and my mother. Emma said honestly. I know, Mitchell replied. That's what makes it real justice. Not some abstract principle, but concrete protection for concrete people. That's the kind of justice that actually matters. As the celebration continued around her, Emma slipped outside into the cool March evening. She stood in the depot courtyard and looked up at the Paris sky, at stars that had witnessed so much history, so much struggle. Somewhere in this city, Robert Thornton was packing his belongings, preparing for a humiliating transfer, nursing his hatred and resentment. Emma felt no satisfaction in his downfall, no joy in his suffering, but she felt relief that his power to hurt others had been broken, relief that the system, just this once, had worked as it was supposed to. The war would end soon. She would return to America, to Birmingham, to a world where the rules that Thornton represented still governed most of life. This victory was small and temporary, limited to this place and this moment, but it was real, and real victories, however small, mattered more than perfect dreams that never came to pass. Emma breathed deep of the Paris air, and felt something she had rarely felt in her 32 years. Peace. Not the peace of safety or certainty, but the peace of knowing she had stood up, had spoken, had refused to accept degradation as inevitable. Tomorrow would bring new struggles, but tonight, justice had been done, and that was enough. The war in Europe ended on the 11th of November 1918, 7 months after the hearing. Church bells rang across Paris, and people poured into the streets, weeping and laughing. The weight of 4 years' horror finally lifted. Emma stood at her washing vat and listened to the celebration echoing through the streets, feeling joy mixed with a strange melancholy. The war was over, but she knew what coming peace meant. Return to America. Return to the world where Robert Thornton's beliefs were not an aberration but the accepted order of things. The army began processing soldiers for return transport. The laundresses would be among the last to leave, required to clean and pack equipment, to wash final loads of uniforms, to prepare the depot for closure. During these final months in Paris, Emma witnessed something that filled her with both hope and heartbreak. Many of the Negro soldiers who had served in France did not want to go home. They had tasted a different world here, had walked streets where their skin did not mark them as less than human, had been served in cafes and invited to homes and treated with basic dignity. Some soldiers married French women, others made plans to return to France after their discharge, to build lives in a country that saw them as men rather than problems to be managed. Emma understood the temptation. She too had experienced the strange freedom of Paris, the relief of being seen as simply human, but her mother was in Birmingham, and duty called her home. Lieutenant Mitchell, who had been promoted to captain for his role in exposing Thornton's abuses, called Emma to his office in late January of 1919. "Miss Williams, I wanted to inform you personally that your service record has been amended. The wage forfeitures have been officially You'll also receive a letter of commendation for your courage in testifying. It won't change much, I know, but it's important that the truth be in the official record." "Thank you, sir," Emma said. "That means more than you might think." "There's something else," Mitchell continued. "The Army is establishing a new protocol for handling discrimination complaints. Your case is being used as a training example for commanding officers. What you did will help protect others." Emma felt tears prick her eyes. "I never wanted to be an example, sir. I just wanted to be treated fairly." "I know," Mitchell said gently, "but sometimes the people who change things are the ones who simply insist on basic dignity. You insisted, and things changed." Emma's ship departed from Le Havre on the 15th of February, 1919. The voyage home took 18 days, the ship crowded with soldiers and support personnel, all heading back to an America that had changed in some ways and not at all in others. Standing on deck as France disappeared behind them, Emma thought about Madame Beaumont, who had wept when they said goodbye and pressed a package of biscuits into Emma's hands for the journey. She thought about Madame Rousseau and the Frenchwomen who had attended the hearing, who had insisted that dignity mattered across all boundaries of race and nation. She thought about Paris itself, that ancient city that had somehow made space for her humanity in ways her own country never had. But she also thought about Sergeant Brooks and Lieutenant Mitchell, about Captain Morrison, who had found the courage to testify against his fellow white officer, about the system that had, however imperfectly, delivered justice when justice was demanded. The ship docked in New York Harbor on a gray March morning. Emma stood on deck, with the other Negro passengers, watching the Statue of Liberty emerge from the mist, that great lady holding her torch high, promising freedom to all who arrived. The irony was not lost on Emma. She was returning to a country where that promise applied differently depending on the color of your skin. The journey from New York to Birmingham took 2 days by train. Emma traveled in the colored car, separated once again by the invisible but absolute line of Jim Crow. She sat by the window and watched. America rolled past cities and farmland. Forests and rivers, and felt the old weight of segregation settling back onto her shoulders like a familiar but unwanted cloak. But something was different now. Emma herself was different. Birmingham looked exactly as she had left it. The same dusty streets, the same segregated neighborhoods, the same careful dance of avoiding white people's eyes. But when Emma walked these familiar streets, she carried Paris inside her like a secret knowledge. Her mother wept when Emma appeared at the door of their small house. They held each other for a long time. Emma, breathing in the smell of her mother's hair, oil and laundry soap, feeling the frailness of the older woman's frame. "My girl," her mother whispered. "My brave girl. I got your letters. I got the money. I read what you did in France." Emma had written carefully edited letters, not wanting to worry her mother with the full truth. But news had a way of traveling, even across oceans. That evening, sitting in their small kitchen, Emma's mother made her favorite meal: black-eyed peas and cornbread, greens cooked with ham hock, sweet tea that tasted like childhood. They ate in comfortable silence, the kind of quiet that exists between people who know each other's hearts. "What was it like?" her mother finally asked. "France, being somewhere different." Emma thought about how to answer. "It was like breathing deeper," she said finally. "Like I didn't know my lungs had been half closed my whole life, until I got somewhere I could breathe all the way." Her mother nodded slowly. "And now you're back, where the air is thin again." "Yes," Emma admitted, "but I remember what it felt like to breathe fully. And remembering changes things." Word of Emma's testimony spread through Birmingham's Negro community. People stopped her on the street, asked questions, treated her with a mixture of admiration and concern. Some praised her courage. Others worried that she had made herself a target, that white folks would remember her as a troublemaker. Emma understood both reactions. Courage and caution were both necessary for survival in a world designed to crush you. She found work at a Negro-owned laundry, working alongside other women who had their own stories of small resistances and quiet dignities. The work was familiar, the steam and soap and endless folding, but Emma approached it differently now, with the knowledge that this was work she chose, not labor extracted under threat. One Sunday, several months after her return, Emma attended service at the church her mother had attended for 40 years. The pastor, Reverend Michael Washington, asked her to give testimony about her experiences in France. Emma stood before the congregation, her hands clasped in front of her, and spoke about Paris. She talked about seeing Negro soldiers walk with their heads high. She talked about French women who smiled without fear. She talked about Madame Beaumont's kindness and Madame Rousseau's support. And she talked about the hearing, about standing up to Robert Thornton, about speaking truth even when power tried to silence her. "I'm not telling you this to brag," Emma said, her voice steady and clear. "I'm telling you so you know that systems of cruelty can be challenged. Not without cost, but they can be challenged. And sometimes, just sometimes, truth wins." The congregation was silent when she finished. Then an old woman in the back began to sing, her voice cracked but strong. "We shall overcome." Others joined in, the song swelling through the small church, voices blending in harmony that spoke of suffering and hope intertwined. Emma felt tears streaming down her face, but she sang to her voice joining the chorus of people who understood that freedom was not a single victory but a long struggle, passed from generation to generation like a sacred trust. In the years that followed, Emma Williams became a quiet force in Birmingham's Negro community. She helped organize workers, taught young women to read and write, attended meetings about civil rights and racial justice. She never sought the spotlight, but her testimony in Paris had given her a kind of moral authority that people respected. She corresponded with Sergeant Brooks, who had left the army and become a teacher in Virginia. His letters told her about the small changes happening in the military, the new policies that made it harder for officers like Thornton to abuse their power, unchecked. She never heard from Robert Thornton again, but she occasionally heard news of him through others. He had left the military in disgrace, returned to Virginia, and lived out his days bitter and diminished. A man whose world had changed in ways he could never accept. Emma felt no satisfaction in his fate. She simply felt grateful that his power to hurt others had ended. On quiet evenings, Emma would sit on her small porch and watch the Birmingham sky turn from blue to gold to deep purple. She would think about Paris, about that strange season when the world had tilted differently, when possibility had felt real and close. She knew she would never return to France. That chapter of her life was closed, but it lived inside her like a candle flame, warming her through the cold seasons, reminding her that the world contained more possibilities than Birmingham's segregated streets suggested. Years later, when the civil rights movement began to build momentum, when young people started sitting at lunch counters and riding buses and demanding the dignity that Emma had tasted briefly in Paris, she understood that she had been part of something larger than herself. Her testimony against Robert Thornton had been one small crack in one small wall, but walls fall through accumulation of cracks, and justice advances through accumulation of small victories. Emma Williams died in 1963, just months before the March on Washington. She was 77 years old. Her funeral was attended by hundreds of people whose lives she had touched, whose courage she had inspired through her quiet example. Reverend Washington spoke at her service. Sister Emma taught us that dignity cannot be given or taken away by others. He said, it lives inside us, waiting for the moment when we choose to claim it. She claimed hers in a laundry depot in Paris, France, and she never let it go. This testimony was found among Emma's effects after her death. The letters from Paris, the official commendation from the US Army, the carefully preserved newspaper clippings in French that she could not read but had kept anyway, and a small package of biscuits, somehow still intact after 4 decades, a gift from Madame Beaumont for a journey that had ended long ago. These materials now rest in the archives of the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute, a quiet testament to one woman's courage and the truth that even the smallest voice, if spoken with dignity and conviction, can echo across generations. Emma Williams was just a laundress, but she was also a witness to the truth that human dignity cannot be permanently suppressed, that systems of cruelty contain within themselves the seeds of their own undoing, and that sometimes justice comes, not in grand gestures, but in quiet persistence. Her story is not unique. Countless others fought similar battles, won similar victories, suffered similar costs, but each story matters. Each testimony counts. Each small crack in the wall of injustice makes the next crack easier. This is the recovered account of Emma Williams, laundress, truth-teller, ordinary woman who did an extraordinary thing by simply refusing to accept lies as inevitable. May her testimony continue to speak to those who come after, reminding us that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to speak truth anyway. May we all find such courage when our moment comes. End of testimony. Archive closed. Memory preserved.